Part 1, Chapter 11 of Canada's 100 Days with the Canadian Corps from Amiens to Mons, August 8 through November 11, 1918. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Canada's 100 Days by John Livesay, Part 1, Chapter 11. Lessons of the Battle. "War is the last thing to go according to program," said Thucydides, and the maxim never had a more striking application than in this battle of Amiens. The enemy were preparing to attack when upon them fell the avalanche. It was all very disconcerting. For the moment they were overwhelmed. Those of their front line troops who escaped capture had their wind up, and spread consternation behind. Besides, they had lost all their guns. Except stout machine gunners in strictly localized defenses, we met very little organized opposition the first day, and our great store of prisoners, guns and material of all kinds was precisely due to the enemy having been massed forward for the assault set for a couple of days later. But as we went forward, conditions began to change in their favor. It is another maxim of war that an attack weakens in its thrust as it progresses, so at the end of the third day, our blow having lost some of its first impetus, being restricted in its full swing by the course of the battle on either flank, and meeting more and more determined resistance from the enemy who had thrown in a number of fresh divisions and again gathered together a respectable body of artillery, our advance perceptibly slowed down. We were coming, too, into a bad country. Hitherto, as we have seen, the enemy's organized defense had been rudimentary. He had paid little attention to his trench system, and there was a minimum of wire. But now we were to advance into the old Somme battlefield, traversed by ancient trench lines, festooned by rusted wire, and passing off solid ground to marshlands, while in our immediate front lay the strong defense line linking up Roye and Chaulnes. It was with these considerations before him that Sir Arthur Currie made very strong representations to the High Command to the effect that the Canadian Corps, having successfully accomplished its allotted task as storm troops, should be pulled out of that area before its bright temper became dulled, to be used in a similar operation on another front, for which he suggested the Bapaume sector as most suitable. However, it was decided that the Corps should do more spade work until at least the French offensive had developed further in the direction of Roye. There was a prospect, too, that the offensive on our left flank, reduced north of the Somme to a static condition before Bray, and thus in turn holding back our immediate neighbors, the Australians, might develop more favorably, when the attacking front would broaden and the Canadian Corps be relieved from its salient, offering new opportunities for further successful exploitation towards the Somme. The desultory riding that followed desultory, not that it was easy but because it led nowhere in particular, proved very expensive for the Canadian Corps, whose task, subjected as it was to a galling enfilade fire, resolved itself into the storming of individual villages. In fact, there was the prospect that we were going to run into another blind alley after the fashion of the offensive of 1916. On to the Somme was the talk in the ranks, but without a true appreciation of the difficulties. When, therefore, the word reached us that we were to be relieved by French divisions, there was a general satisfaction. We understood, of course, that it meant we were to have a go-in elsewhere. It is worth noting here that Field Marshal Haig, in his Victory Dispatch, endorses the opinion submitted by the Canadian Corps Commander. "By the evening of August 12," he writes, "our infantry had reached the old German Somme defenses of 1916, on the general line west of Damery, east of Lyons, east of Proyart, having repulsed with severe loss determined counter-attacks in the neighborhood of Lyons. North of the Somme we were on the western outskirts of Bray-sur-Somme. The derelict battle area which now lay before our troops, seared by old trench lines, pitted with shell holes, and crossed in all directions with tangled belts of wire, the whole covered by the wild vegetation of 2 years, presented unrivaled opportunities for stubborn machine gun defenses. Attacks carried out on Aug. 13 proved the strength of these positions and showed that the enemy, heavily reinforced, was ready to give battle for them. I therefore determined to break off the battle on this front and transferred the front of attack from the Fourth Army to the sector north of the Somme, where an attack seemed unexpected by the enemy. My intention was for the Third Army to operate in the direction of Bapaume, so as to turn the lines of the old Somme defenses from the north. The French First Army now ceased to be under my command. Meanwhile, south of the Somme, our pressure was to be maintained so as to take advantage of any weakening on the part of the enemy and encourage in him the belief that we intended to persist in our operations on that front. During the succeeding days, local attacks gave us possession of Damery, Parvillers, and Fransart, and made progress also at other points." In fact, our whole conduct of the war had changed under the masterly direction of Foch. Our attacks henceforth were to be restricted in their objectives and only to be developed as their successful progress opened out without too great cost further fields for exploitation. In effect, the battle of Amiens was now broken off, so far as the British forces went, and there immediately opened the less ambitious but locally successful attack in the direction of Bapaume. Then in turn came the battle of Arras and the beginning of the Hindenburg Line by the Canadian Corps. Thereafter the whole fabric of the enemy defense began to give way, and it was the beginning of the end. Before leaving the battlefield, some tactical considerations are worthy of note. It cannot be said that in its broad aspects the battle presented any new tactical features. It merely applied successfully the plan Sir Julian Byng had originated for his Third Army in the first battle of Cambrai of the preceding November. He failed, relatively at least to his hopes, because he had not at his disposal sufficient forces to exploit his initial success, nor even to properly defend the ground won. But that did not invalidate his plan, which consisted of a surprise attack, unaccompanied by artillery preparation, the free use of tanks being counted on to break the road for the infantry, combined with an intensive barrage laid down on the enemy front and support lines and battery positions. That plan changed the nature of the combat on the Western Front, converting it from trench fighting to open warfare. The enemy was quick to adopt it in his March offensive, and with perfect success, his means being adequate to his purpose. It was now for the first time successfully employed by the British arms. The plan was developed to its highest extent by the employment of a tremendous barrage, designed to carry the infantry deep into enemy territory; by the presence of an unprecedented number of tanks, including the newly perfected Whippets; by the bringing up of the cavalry corps; and, last but not least, by the co-operation of the independent force under General Brutinel of Canadian Motor Machine Gun Brigades and Cyclists. Brutinel's independent force, as we have seen, did valuable and particularly gallant work along the Roye road, where in the early stage of the battle it acted as the liaison between the French and our own 3rd Division. But it too was denied the chance of breaking through, and because its operations were necessarily confined to metalled roads, held everywhere in great strength by the enemy, its offensive role was limited. Its 1st. Brigade was fighting over the same ground where it had won imperishable fame in the March retreat. Over 100 heavy tanks were assigned to the attack, and of these 2/3 had become casualties from one cause and another by the end of the 3rd day. Some were "walking wounded" cases only, but many were destroyed by direct hits. Without question the tanks played a great and formidable part in this battle, and if the war had continued another year, no doubt they would have become a still more effective arm. But that they were not vital to success was proved by the Canadian Corps later on, when its supply of tanks, at first scanty, rapidly was reduced to the vanishing point. The tank indeed, and its tactical management, was still in process of evolution, even up to the close of hostilities. It was perhaps Britain's greatest material contribution to the war. Early tanks failed or achieved but a moiety of success, because they were too slow and too vulnerable. The enemy, after his first shock of surprise, affected to take them lightly, but nevertheless, captured documents proved that he was anxious, commanders being warned to be prepared, to pay special attention to anti-tank defense, and to train men with the anti-tank guns, a magnified rifle weighing 35 pounds, of which several fell into our hands in the Amiens show. The great width and depth of the Hindenburg ditch was designed to stop tanks. After the considerable French success with tanks southwest of Soissons in July, and our own in the present battle, his alarms increased. His own tanks were a failure because of poor design, the flat underbody preventing the climbing of obstacles, and he never had enough to make them really formidable. In the Amiens show the tanks were massed and the wastage was so great that replacements on the same scale were difficult, especially as the widening of the battle line made an effective tank concentration more and more out of the question. In the Arras defensive very few tanks were in our line, and in the Battle of Cambrai, because of the impassable nature of canals and rivers encountered, they were almost entirely absent. Very few in fact were left at all in the closing stages of the great offensive, and a localized concentration to overcome machine gun resistance became impossible. Had it been otherwise, our casualties would have been lighter. For the tank is the ideal weapon for destroying machine gun nests. Time after time in the Amiens show, tanks were driven right over these emplacements, either killing or capturing their garrisons. If war comes again in our time, the tank has a great future. The Whippets have a special mission of their own, the up-to-date cavalry. But the heavy tank must also have sufficient speed to keep well ahead of infantry on necessity, strong enough armor plating to resist all but direct hits by field guns, powerful offensive armament to overcome strong fortified posts, and such bulk and engine power as can traverse not only natural obstacles, except canals and rivers, but the protective ditches dug by the enemy. Above all, they must have wider range of vision and be in direct communication not only with their own units, but with other arms, especially infantry. For at present the tank, once started, is a law unto itself, and too often becomes detached. In the darkness and fog of the early morning of August 8, they often lost their way, overrunning their objectives or missing them altogether. Compasses were useless because of the mass of metal, and shut in that fiery box a general survey is impossible. One tank was observed coming back from the front line when its commander supposed he was working forward. Even in the last days of the war, there appeared to be two schools of thought in regard to tank tactics. One, as exemplified in the Amiens show, was that long lines of tanks should go in ahead of the infantry and overrun the enemy. In many cases they sailed right over dugouts and past machine gun posts they could not see in the murk, so that our infantry following up had a hard time of it. And the trouble was that when a tank was wanted to reduce such a fortified point, the infantry had no means of making their need known. The other was that tanks should be held in leash close up behind the infantry, to be employed on individual work as required. A quite possible development might be that each brigade, or even each battalion, would have its own tank section, to work in tactical conjunction. Extraordinary gallant men, these tank crews. The Suicide Club, our boys called them. One of our officers, a very brave man, went forward in one of them to reconnoiter. When finally he was let out, he shook his fist at his hosts. "Never again, demon, will I enter your scalding bowels." Tank crews, indeed, were under a terrible strain, both physical and mental, greater even than that of the stokers of a battleship in action. In that confined space, filled with poisonous gases, the atmosphere was all but insupportable. Tank crews have been known to come out of their fortress and thrown themselves on the ground in utter exhaustion amid the full fury of an enemy barrage. A full day's battle, such as August 8, played them out, and there was great difficulty in getting the tank crews back into shape for the battle of the following day. That, indeed, was to some extent the cause of our delay in continuing the offensive on August 9. In such a case the strategist, laying out his battle for the morrow, is apt to overlook the purely physical element of his problem. Where the fighting is to be continuous over a period of days, it is necessary to furnish relief crews for the tanks. A good number of Canadians were scattered through the tank crews, but it was an Imperial service, the great majority of officers and men being old country. If the war had gone on, a Canadian Tank Division would have been created. As it was, complete mutual confidence existed between our infantry and the tanks. As explained, these were limited in their scope, but that was the inherent defect of the machine and not the crew. So important was the part of the tank in the battle that this rather lengthy digression may be permitted. We have seen that there was nothing particularly novel about the tactics of the Amiens show, but the whole plan was brought to the highest perfection, and the employment of a fresh and thoroughly trained body of troops such as the Canadian Corps assured success in advance. As it turned out, the weight of the battle fell on the Canadian Corps, but that was not the original design. The Fourth Army was to advance on its entire front, with British troops on the left and Australians in the centre and Canadians on the right, the most difficult ground perhaps being assigned to the latter. When this movement had well developed, the French First Army was to take up the battle on our right. But this programme was diverted by reason of the situation north of the Somme. Here the enemy had attacked the 3rd British Corps in great strength 2 days before, and was bringing up reserves for a further thrust in the development of his intended general offensive against Amiens. It turned out therefore that instead of making much progress, troops in this sector had all they could do to hold their own. The hope of recovering the strong point of Bray needlessly given up in March fell to the ground. As a consequence, the left of the Canadian Corps was obliged to conform, and though its centre pushed well forward and its right kept pace with ourselves, it was unable to attain tactical freedom of manoeuvre. On the other hand, our right, the French battle went so well after it had gained momentum that it spread far to the south, eventually including Montdidier, and the effect of this was to make the Canadian area the pivotal centre of the entire battle front. At all stages, and until we gave over to the French, our line was in greater or less degree a marked salient, and this of course exposed our men to enfilade artillery fire, now from one flank, now from the other, and sometimes from both. It is necessary to have a clear picture of this in order to appreciate the sterling character of their work, especially in such tactical adventures as the capture of Chilly, Hallu, Parvillers, Damery, Fransart, and La Chavette. Their success was not brought about by accident. Skilled and patient staff work, perfect organization by both A and Q branches, the devoted efforts of the Canadian Engineers and Army Service Corps, fine qualities of leadership from divisional commanders right down to the veteran N.C.O.s, all these contributed, but the greatest factor of all were the men themselves, highly disciplined, fresh from a period of intensive training, and conspicuous in the qualities of initiative and resource that had stood the Canadian soldier in such good stead on many a hard-fought field. One need not speak of their courage, the common heritage of the nations, but they possessed in a peculiar degree the quality of the race that declines to envisage defeat and will not be denied victory. The moral effect of this great victory was far-reaching. For the first time in many a long day, troops of the British armies had taken the offensive on the grand scale and had demonstrated that man for man, in leadership and technical equipment, they were the superior of the enemy. That was the great contribution that the Canadian Corps, and with them the Australians, made to the cause of the Allies on August 8. They restored confidence in the British arms weakened in morale and repute in the sight of both our allies and the enemy since the sad days of March, not only to the rank and file of the armies themselves, but to the world at large. Looking back over but a few months, yet this nevertheless a gulf fast obliterating memory and almost impassable to the imagination from the sure vantage ground of British victories in every theatre of the war, it seems all but incredible that in those days immediately preceding Amiens, and notwithstanding the demonstration of the French on the Marne, Doubts actually existed in the ability of the British armies to carry out a successful offensive. Yet so it was. These doubts, totally without justification as the event proved, were finally dispelled on Aug. 8. Thus ended L.C. Operation, as it was named by the Canadian Corps Staff, for the battle cry on the morning of Aug. 8 was, "Remember the Llandovery Castle." The hospital ship sunk in the Irish Sea just before, with Canadian medical officers and nurses on board. And what did the enemy think of it? Von Hutier, who commanded in this front, was brother-in-law of Ludendorff, and the best face must be put on it. "We were up against the elite of the French army and the celebrated Canadian Corps," said the German higher staff. It is not generally known that this great battle of Amiens was intended to be the last British offensive on the West Front in 1918, and it was only because of the unexpected success attained that our offensives were everywhere continued. The original program granted a reasonable measure of success such as should free the Amiens-Paris railway was that thereafter the troops should settle down into winter quarters, and await the coming of the American armies to renew the offensive in the spring of 1919. This bold stroke, in which the Canadian Corps had so striking a part, not only opened the floodgates of victory, but saved for us the long weary months of trench warfare and the heavy casualties they entail. With Ludendorff, Aug. 8 is obviously an obsession. We have seen above something of his opinion. "The 8th of August," he says in another place, "marked the downfall of our righting strength and destroyed our hopes of strategic amelioration. To continue the war was to start a gamble. The war had to be ended." He returns again and again to the fatal day. "The 8th of August, 1918, is the black day of the German army in the history of the war. I have experienced none worse, except during the events beginning with September 15, which took place on the Bulgarian front and sealed the fate of the Central Powers. The English colonials and the French broke deep into our line between the Somme and the Luce, where our divisions were completely overrun. 6 or 7 German divisions, which could be described as thoroughly fit for battle, had been defeated. 2 or 3 divisions and the remnants of the defeated forces were ready to close the wide gap between Bray and Roye." And he concludes by speaking of the contemplated retirement in this section of the line. "This movement," he says, "was decided upon the night of Aug. 9 to 10. If it did not succeed, a great Allied victory was possible." End of Part 1, Chapter 11.